It was a Friday, unlike any other. The city of Jerusalem shook under a sky dark as death. The earth trembled. The temple veil tore in two. At the center of it all stood a Roman soldier, the man who drove a spear into the side of Jesus Christ. Who was he? Why would a hardened centurion, trained to kill without mercy, fall to his knees and confess, truly, this was the Son of God? What happened to him after that dreadful day? And why does history remember his name, Longinus, as both executioner and witness? What would it take for a soldier of Rome, loyal to Caesar, to abandon his armor and die for the very man he had crucified? What power could change a heart of stone into a heart of faith? This story is not just history, it's a mirror. It forces us to ask, what would we have seen under that darkened sky? What would we have done at the foot of the cross? In this video, the veil will be lifted. The dark fate of the soldier who pierced Christ will be revealed. And as the truth of the cross unfolds, you will not only see what he saw, you will feel the weight he felt. By the end, you will know the soldier, and you will stand before the same truth that shattered his life forever. And before we begin, if this story touches you, like, subscribe for more, and leave the number 777 in the comments, your quiet sign of faith in the one who died and rose again. Before that dark Friday, his name was Longinus. To the Roman world, he was strength and loyalty carved in flesh. To the Jews, he was fear in human form. His life was forged in iron. Every breath he took was marked by toughness, violence, and duty. To rise as a centurion required more than brute strength. It demanded intelligence, strategy, and above all, a ruthless will. Longinus carried all of these within him. Yet on that day, under a sky soon to turn black, this soldier of empire would step into a moment that shattered history and find himself no longer merely Rome's instrument, but a witness to the Son of God. Him bronze helmet, catching the glare of the Sunday breastplate strapped tight, the crimson crest of rank marking him above the common soldier. In his hands rested command over more than 100 men, each trained to kill without hesitation. He embodied order, discipline, ruthlessness. To the Romans, he was a hero of efficiency. To the Jews, he was the face of terror. Centurions were not chosen by chance. They rose from blood and sweat on the battlefield, hardened by countless campaigns. Courage, strategy, and cruelty were their currency. They did not flinch at death. They dealt it out like rations of bread. Longinus fit the mold perfectly. His loyalty was unquestioned, his obedience absolute, his conscience silenced by years of duty. That morning in Jerusalem, his task was clear: supervise the punishment of a condemned Jew who claimed to be the Son of God. To Rome, it was just another execution. To the priests, it was the silencing of blasphemy. To Longinus, it was another day of orders. He stood as Jesus was stripped, bound, and scourged. The whip tore into flesh, lashing again and again, each strike drawing blood. Soldiers laughed as they pressed thorns into his brow, scarlet streams running down his face. They draped a mock robe over his shoulders, placed a reed in his hand, and bowed in cruel jest. "Hail, King of the Jews!" Longinus watched, arms folded, face carved from stone. This was not new to him. He had seen men beg, scream, curse. He had seen eyes wide with terror, bodies broken by the lash. Violence was his daily bread. Yet something he could not name shifted inside him. The prisoner before him did not resist. He did not curse his torturers. He did not plead for mercy. He bore it all with a silence that unsettled even a hardened centurion. The laughter of the soldiers rang hollow against that silence. The mockery felt small in the presence of such calm. For the first time in years, Longinus felt a tremor deep within. He did not join in their mockery. He simply stared, his eyes locked on the face of the man crowned with thorns. And though he would not admit it, his heart faltered. The Jews saw him as the enemy, the executioner. Rome saw him as the perfect weapon. But in that moment, Longinus was neither fully the one nor the other. He was caught in between the iron of empire on one side and a strange, unspoken truth pressing on the other. That tension would not leave him, not when the whips fell, not when the robe was torn away, not when the order came to march the prisoner toward the hill of skulls. And so the centurion, the man of steel, began to crack not with weakness, but with wonder. What kind of man was this, who endured pain without hatred? What kind of king was this, who bled and yet stood in dignity? The questions gnawed at him, unspoken. The soldier who had silenced his conscience for years now found it whispering again, and beneath the roar of the crowd, beneath the hammering of fists and the cruelty of his own men, Longinus felt something stir an ember he could not yet name, but one that would one day consume him. The questions gnawed at him, unspoken. The soldier who had silenced his conscience for years now found it whispering again, and beneath the roar of the crowd, beneath the hammering of fists and the cruelty of his own men, Longinus felt something stir, an ember he could not yet name, but one that would one day consume him. The judgment hall was heavy with noise, yet one voice refused to rise. Jesus stood before Pilate, bruised and bound, and when the governor pressed him with questions, he answered with silence. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked. Jesus replied only, "You have said so." Beyond that, nothing. No defense, no cry for justice, no bargaining for his life. The Gospels tell us he made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Matthew 27:11-14. Longinus stood at his post, watching. He had seen trials before. He had seen criminals claw for life, spitting out excuses, pleading, cursing, collapsing in fear. But this one, this Nazarene, was different. His silence did not feel like defeat. It felt like strength, and that strength unsettled the soldier whose life had been built on steel and order. Then came the messenger. A servant rushed to Pilate, whispering the words of his wife, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much in a dream because of him." Matthew 27:19. A warning from the unseen. A shadow in the air. Pilate shifted uneasily, but the crowd, stirred by priests and elders, grew louder, fiercer. Their voices shook the stone walls. "Barabbas! Release Barabbas! Barabbas the murderer, the insurrectionist." A man guilty of blood was granted freedom, while the innocent was condemned. The Roman custom of mercy turned into a theater of injustice. Pilate washed his hands before the multitude, claiming innocence. But Longinus knew no basin of water could wash the weight of this choice. And so the order was given. The cross was prepared. The procession began. Longinus marched at the front as the condemned man staggered under the rough beam. The streets of Jerusalem narrowed with the press of bodies. Some shouted in mockery, others spat with hatred. Yet from the edges came sobs, the wailing of women who saw beyond the surface. Then it happened. The prisoner fell, crushed beneath the weight. His body, lacerated and bleeding, could no longer carry the wood. The centurion seized a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, and forced him to lift the burden. Luke 23:26. It was standard procedure, another command carried out. Yet in that moment, Jesus lifted his face not in resentment, but in gratitude. Even beaten, he gave thanks. The crowd swelled again, but his words cut through like a blade. He turned to the daughters of Jerusalem, women weeping for him, and spoke, "Do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children." Luke 23:28. Imagine it. A man condemned to die, bleeding from crown to heel, offering comfort to others. It was not weakness. It was not resignation. It was prophecy. It was compassion flowing where hatred should have been. Longinus heard those words, and something shook inside him. He had watched countless prisoners curse their mothers, curse their gods, curse Rome itself. But this man spoke of others. This man, stumbling toward execution, bore the dignity of a king. And then, came the moment no soldier could forget. At a street corner, through the shifting crowd, a woman rushed forward, her veil damp with tears, her hands trembling. Mary the mother. John beside her, struggling to steady her grief. She pressed near, reaching for her son. Longinus raised his arm to keep order. Yet even he could not silence the raw cry of a mother meeting her condemned child. Jesus, with what little strength remained, whispered to her, "Behold, I make all things new." Not a plea, not despair, a declaration, a promise uttered in blood. Longinus clenched his jaw. For years he had obeyed Rome without thought, without question. But here, under the weight of this silence and these strange words, cracks formed in the armor of his certainty. Who was this prisoner? What kind of man carried his cross with such calm, spoke of hope while walking toward death, and comforted others as his own life drained away? The question burned in his chest, but there was no time for answers. The hill of skulls awaited, and Longinus knew the worst was yet to come. But what happens when the noise begins to change? What happens when the execution becomes something more than death? What happens when a dying man prays not for himself, but for his killers? The Hill of Skulls was a place of noise, jeering voices, hammer strikes, the labored groans of the condemned. Yet as the crosses were lifted and set into the earth, something changed. A weight fell upon the air, heavier than iron, heavier than death itself. Longinus stood at his post, eyes fixed on the man in the center. Nails pierced his hands, nails tore through his feet. The wood shook as the cross dropped into its hole. Yet no scream of hatred came from his mouth, no curse against Rome, no threat against his executioners. Instead, his voice rose weak but clear enough for every soldier to hear. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23:34. The words struck like lightning. Forgive them? Forgive us? Longinus felt his chest tighten. Forgiveness, aimed at murderers. Forgiveness, aimed at him. He had overseen many deaths, but never had a prisoner prayed for his killers. He had seen men spit venom at their last breath. He had seen despair, rage, blasphemy, but never mercy, never love. Around him the mockery continued. Some shouted, "If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." Others laughed, tossing insults like stones. Yet even in his agony, the Nazarene's eyes searched, not with bitterness, but with compassion. Then one of the criminals crucified beside him hurled curses, demanding proof of power. But the other, broken, gasping, spoke words that cut through the chaos. "We are punished justly, but this man has done nothing wrong. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And the answer came steady, sure. "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Luke 23:43. Paradise. In the shadow of death, he promised life. Longinus clenched his spear tighter. He had witnessed imperial pardons given to rebels, but this was different. This was not Caesar's mercy. This was the authority of eternity itself. Then the sky began to shift. The sun dimmed. The horizon bled into darkness. From the 6th hour until the 9th, an unnatural night swallowed the land. Mark 15:33. The sun itself seemed to bow. Creation itself seemed to mourn. Voices grew uneasy. Soldiers glanced at each other with suspicion. Even the mockers faltered. Longinus lifted his eyes. Jerusalem lay under a shroud of black. The earth groaned. Stones split. In the temple far away, though he could not see it, the great veil was torn from top to bottom. Heaven itself seemed to cry out that this death was not like any other. And there, beneath the trembling ground and the weight of shadow, Longinus felt it break inside him. The silence of Jesus, the mercy for his killers, the promise of paradise, the darkness that fell without warning at all, pressed upon him like fire on metal. His lips moved before his mind could restrain them. His voice cracked against the storm. "Truly, This man was the Son of God. Mark 15:39. The centurion who had mocked nothing, who had obeyed everything, now stood undone at the foot of the cross. The soldier of empire became a witness of eternity. And yet, the story was not finished. The man who pierced with nails, who guarded with spears, would soon pierce again, and what happened next would change his fate forever. What proof would satisfy Rome? What sign would silence doubt? What price would certify that death had truly come? The hill was no longer filled with shouts. It was haunted by silence. Where had the voices gone? The same voices that screamed, "Crucify him," only moments before. Why did the crowd, once so fierce, now tremble and scatter? 3 crosses pierced the sky like blackened spears. 2 men still writhed, gasping in agony, clinging to what little life remained. But the man in the center, why was he so still? Why had death come to him first? And what did that silence mean? And now came the order. No body could remain on a cross as the Sabbath approached. The condemned had to be finished. Quickly, efficiently, brutally, the soldiers moved first to the thieves. With heavy iron mallets, they shattered their legs, forcing death to rush upon them in suffocating waves. Bones cracked, screams split the air. Longinus stood close, his face carved with duty, his hands steady on the spear. This was procedure. This was law. Then they turned to the one in the center. But Jesus did not breathe. His head had already bowed. His lips had already fallen silent. Still, Roman law demanded proof. A centurion had to certify death. That task fell to Longinus. What happened next would change him forever. He stepped forward. The ground shook faintly under his boots. The cross loomed above him, the body limp, the silence unbearable. He braced his spear. One thrust, one strike, to end the uncertainty. Steel cut through flesh, and in that instant, John the Evangelist tells us, at once, blood and water came out. John 19:34-35. Blood and water. Not one, but both, flowing together from the side of the crucified Christ. Longinus froze. He had pierced countless men before, but never had he seen this. Never had he felt this. The red of sacrifice mingled with the clear stream of life. It poured down, and as he looked up, drops struck his face. Tradition tells us that his eyes, clouded for years, weakened by some hidden ailment, were touched by that holy flow. The blood and the water ran down, and suddenly he could see, sight restored. Eyes opened, not just to light, but to truth. The executioner, standing beneath the cross, marked not by the wounds he inflicted, but healed by them. The soldier who pierced was pierced in return, his blindness undone. His heart struck open. The wound was his own now. Prophecy had spoken long before. They will look on the one they have pierced. Zechariah 12:10. And now, in the shadow of Golgotha, that prophecy burned into reality. Longinus had looked. He had pierced. And in looking, he was pierced himself. Blood to redeem, water to cleanse. A sign for the church that would come. A mystery deeper than the spear could reach. From his side, rivers of grace poured forth, baptism, communion, the very life of the Spirit. And the first to feel it was not a disciple, not a priest, not a prophet. It was a Roman centurion. What irony, what glory. The hand that enforced the empire became the first hand touched by this flood of mercy. The eyes that stared coldly at death became the eyes washed by living water. Longinus staggered. The spear fell heavy in his grip. His breath caught in his throat. This was no ordinary man. This was no ordinary death. The signs were too clear, the silence too holy, the blood too pure, the water too clean. He looked again, this time not as a soldier, but as a man undone. He had killed, and yet he was healed. He had pierced, and yet he was forgiven. He had shed another man's blood, and yet that very blood gave him life. something collapsed inside him. Years of obedience, years of violence, years of iron discipline all cracked open in a single flow of blood and water. The man who once executed without hesitation now stood trembling, staring, unable to explain what he had witnessed. But he could feel it. This was not the end of a prisoner. This was the beginning of something eternal. The cross was not just an instrument of death. It was a fountain that had just reached him. The other soldiers moved on, restless, trying to shake off the weight of the moment. But Longinus remained. His spear was stained, his face was wet, his eyes were opened. And in that strange mixture of fear and awe, one truth pressed upon him like fire. The man he pierced had pierced him deeper, and that wound would never close. What would he do with it? Where could he go now, with eyes that had seen too much, with a soul branded by blood and water? He did not yet know. But the soldier of Rome was no longer roams alone. Something greater had claimed him. What happens when the hand that once held the spear lays it down forever? And what happens when a man who killed without hesitation chooses to die without fear? This is the riddle of Longinus. The centurion who pierced Christ could not return to Rome's embrace. The barracks, the drills, the iron discipline, none of it could contain the fire that now burned inside him. He stripped off the armor, laid down the sword, and turned his back on the eagle standard. The empire lost a commander. Heaven gained a witness. Tradition tells us he left his rank behind and walked among those he once despised. He sought out the disciples, listened to their trembling voices as they spoke of the resurrection, and added his own testimony. I saw him die, and in his death I found life. His words carried a weight no one could deny. This was not rumor, not hearsay. This was the confession of the very soldier who had stood at the foot of the cross. From Jerusalem, he traveled to distant lands, Cappadocia, Caesarea. Towns and villages whispered of him. The Roman executioner turned preacher. His steps were no longer those of a conqueror, but of a messenger. And everywhere he went, he spoke of the one who forgave, the one who promised paradise, the one whose side he pierced, and yet who healed him. But empire does not forgive betrayal. Rome could tolerate many things, but not a soldier who defected to a crucified Jew. The shadow of the eagle followed him. Spies listened. Officials grew restless. And one day, the inevitable came. He was arrested. The interrogation was harsh, but he did not flinch. The same man who once executed orders without hesitation now stood unshaken in chains. They demanded denial. They offered freedom if only he would renounce the crucified Christ. But Longinus, with a peace sharper than steel, refused. His loyalty was no longer bound to Caesar. It was bound to the Lamb who had been slain. The verdict was death, not on a battlefield, not in the dignity of Roman armor, but in shame as a traitor. They dragged him outside the city to a lonely place. The soldier who had watched others die countless times now stood on the other side of the blade. Yet he did not resist. He did not curse. He did not beg. He lifted his gaze, just as he once saw Jesus lift his gaze from the cross, and he surrendered his spirit. A sword fell. His head rolled. The empire silenced him. To the world, it was a dark and final end. A centurion reduced to dust, a traitor erased. To Rome, his body was nothing more than waste to be disposed of, burned or buried without honor. Yet for the faithful who gathered in secret, his tomb became a holy place. They spoke of healings, of prayers answered where his remains lay. The one who had carried out death was remembered as a witness of life. The paradox was complete. Once the hand of execution, now the voice of testimony. Once the empire's weapon, now the church's martyr. In the eyes of men, his fate was black, shameful, consumed like ashes. But in the eyes of God, his end was not an extinguishing, but a crown. And so the story of Longinus, the soldier of Rome, did not close with the blade it opened into something eternal. The story of Longinus is not just a chapter in ancient history. It is a mirror held up to every soul who dares to look. Because in his life, in his piercing, in his blindness, in his healing, in his martyrdom, we see the truth about the cross and the truth about ourselves. When the spear tore into Christ's side, something greater was torn open. John tells us, "At once there came out blood and water." John 19:34-35. Not a random detail, not a coincidence. Blood and water, the two streams that would flow into the life of the church. The fathers of the faith saw in that moment the sacraments themselves. Blood for the Eucharist, water for baptism. The very heart of Christ became the fountain from which grace would never cease. And who was the first to see it? Not Peter, not John, not a priest of Israel, a Roman centurion, a man of violence, a man who carried out the orders of death. The first to look, the first to be touched, the first to be changed. The man who pierced Christ became the first to witness the streams of salvation. The one who opened the wound was the one who was healed by it. The executioner became the example. That is the scandal of grace. That is the glory of the cross. If Longinus could be forgiven, then who is beyond hope? If the very hand that struck the blow could be cleansed, then what stain on your soul is too dark to be washed away? If the empire's instrument could be transformed into God's witness, then what excuse remains for despair? The blood that ran down that spear is the same blood offered in the cup. The water that washed his eyes is the same water poured in baptism. It is no distant story. It is here. It is now. It flows for you. The cross is not just a relic of sorrow. It is the meeting place of judgment and mercy. It is where sin is named and where sinners are restored. It is where the proud are broken and the broken are lifted. Longinus reminds us that no one stands outside the reach of God's hand. Not the pagan, not the murderer, not the traitor, not even the one who drives the spear. There is always room at the foot of the cross. There is always forgiveness in the blood. There is always cleansing in the water. And so the story turns on us. Will we stand at a distance, unmoved, while Christ hangs before us? Or will we step closer, as Longinus did, and allow the flood of grace to fall upon us? Will we keep our armor of pride and indifference? Or will we let it crack open and receive a new heart? The lesson is sharp, but it is also tender. We are called to trade arrogance for humility, to lay down indifference and take up repentance, to let the story of the soldier become the story of our own souls. The same cross that transformed Longinus still stands. The same Christ who forgave his executioners still whispers, "Father, forgive them." The same Spirit that opened the eyes of a Roman centurion can open yours. So, if even the soldier who pierced him could find mercy, what about you? If even the empire's executioner could become a saint, what about your story? If grace reached him, can it not reach you too? Do not let this just be his story. Make it yours. Stand under the shadow of the cross. Feel the blood and water fall. Let it wash you, cleanse you, remake you. Because the truth is as clear as it was that dark Friday. No one is beyond the reach of God's saving love. And so, the question remains not what happened to Longinus. We know his fate. The true question is this: what will you do with the cross that changed him? What will you do with the grace that still flows? The story of Longinus closes with what men called a dark fate. To Rome, he was nothing more than a traitor, executed, silenced, erased. His death was shame in the eyes of the empire. But heaven saw something different. Heaven saw the crown of a witness. Heaven saw the glory of a man who once pierced Christ and then confessed with trembling lips, "Truly, this was the Son of God." This is the paradox of grace. What looks like defeat to the world is victory before God. What looks like ashes to men is honor in eternity. And the soldier's story stands as a reminder. No one is beyond the reach of the cross. So now I ask you, are you willing to let the cross transform your life as it transformed his? Will you allow the blood and the water to wash over your story? as it once washed over his. Remember, the same grace that opened the eyes of a Roman centurion is here for you today. If this story has touched you, I invite you. Share your own story in the comments below. There are no easy answers, but sometimes your testimony is exactly what someone else needs to hear. Sometimes your words are the key that unlocks peace for another heart. And let this be your confession. If you believe that Christ can turn even a soldier of Rome into a saint of God, type 777 in the comments as your sign of faith. Tap like to stand with this message. Subscribe to continue walking with us, and share so that others can find the same hope. May the blessing of the Lord be upon you. May His cross be your strength, and may His grace never cease to open your eyes. Few people know this, but there is a verse in the Bible that states that Jesus descended into hell, and what He did there will surprise you. Buried in the pages of Scripture lies a verse easy to overlook, but impossible to ignore once seen. It claims something astonishing. For centuries, scholars have debated it. Theologians have dissected it. Believers have wondered, prayed, speculated. What really happened during those 3 silent days between the cross and the empty tomb? The Bible offers clues, fragments of revelation. It speaks of spirits in prison, the lower parts of the earth, and keys to death and Hades. But what do these mean? Where exactly was Jesus while His body lay cold and sealed in stone? And more importantly, what was He doing in the darkest corners of existence? To find the answer, we return to one of the most electrifying moments in human history. The sky darkened. The earth trembled. Jesus, nailed and bloodied, lifted His voice through the pain. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Luke 23:46. That cry wasn't just His last breath. It was the opening of a gate. In that instant, something unseen shattered across the spiritual realm. Heaven didn't just mourn, it moved. The Gospel of Matthew 27:50-53 records it. The temple veil was torn from top to bottom. The ground cracked. Stones split. Graves opened. And the dead, yes, the dead rose. No death in history had ever caused such supernatural upheaval. But the most profound moment wasn't what the world could see. Something deeper was unfolding. The Son of God was descending. Scripture tells us that before the cross, the dead didn't go to heaven. They went to Sheol, the underworld, a real spiritual place, split into 2 realms. One, a place of rest for the righteous, the bosom of Abraham. The other, a realm of torment for the wicked. And between them, a great, uncrossable chasm. Jesus Himself described it in Luke 16. A rich man in agony. Lazarus at peace. A gulf fixed between. This is the world Jesus entered. Not as a ghost, not as a visitor, but as a redeemer. But not yet. Before we follow Him into the shadows, we must understand this. His death was no accident. It was voluntary. John 10:18 makes it crystal clear. "No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and to take it up again." Even in death, Jesus was sovereign. He wasn't defeated. He wasn't passive. He was moving. He was conquering. When His spirit left His body, it didn't vanish, it advanced. The torn veil in the temple wasn't just symbolism. It was a signal. Heaven was no longer off limits. The way to God was being restored. But this restoration wasn't descending from above. It was rising up from the very depths. The journey of the crucified one didn't begin in glory. It began in darkness. It didn't begin in the clouds. It began beneath the earth. This wasn't improvisation. It was prophecy. Centuries earlier, King David had seen a glimpse. "You will not abandon my soul to Sheol," he wrote in Psalm 16:10. "Nor will you let your Holy One see decay." Peter would later quote that verse in Acts 2, applying it directly to Jesus. and it fits perfectly. Jesus did descend into the realm of the dead, but he didn't stay. He walked through Sheol with purpose, with authority, with fire in his eyes, and redemption in his steps. He entered in death, but would return in glory. The gates of death were not the end. They were the mission field. And what happened next would shake the very foundations of hell itself. While his disciples wept and the world believed it was over, Jesus' body was gently wrapped in linen and sealed inside a stone-cold tomb. But his spirit, it was wide awake, alert, active, on a mission. What happened next wasn't just a theological footnote. It was a critical part of the eternal planon, hidden from human eyes, but thunderous in the unseen realm. Christ had not simply come to die. He came to confront death itself, to step into its territory, to dismantle it from within, to liberate what had been bound for ages. What the world saw was stillness mourning, darkness, silence. But behind the curtain of reality, something was shaking. Death had been wounded, hell stirred, and the unseen world found itself invaded by a presence they never thought would come, the living one. But where exactly did Jesus go? Scripture calls it the lower parts of the earth, a phrase cloaked in mystery, yet full of meaning. This was Sheol, the world of the dead, a hidden realm, as real as it was unreachable, spoken of by prophets, taught by Jesus himself. To understand what Jesus did there, we have to understand what that place was. Sheol wasn't just one vast void. It was divided. On one side, Abraham's bosom, also called Paradise, a resting place for the righteous, a peaceful holding ground for the faithful who had believed before the Messiah came, a sacred waiting room. Men like Abel, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Elijah, David, Daniel, Ruth. They were there resting, waiting, trusting in a promise not yet fulfilled. And then there was the other side, a place of darkness, agony, separation, the abode of the damned. Those who had rejected the truth in life now remembered in torment what they had once ignored. Jesus described it all in Luke 16. The rich man, suffering in fire, begging for a drop of water. Lazarus, comforted in Abraham's arms. A chasm between them, uncrossable, permanent. There was no rescue from that place, no second chance. This was the structure of Sheol, and Jesus knew it well. That's why, when he spoke to the thief on the cross, he didn't say, heaven. He said, today you will be with me in paradise. Luke 23:43. Paradise, at that moment, wasn't in the clouds. It was beneath the earth. And Christ was going there not to be comforted, but to begin a revolution. His arrival would change everything. He came not as a guest, but as a liberator. He came to those who had waited in faith, to open the door that had been shut since Eden, to break the silence that had lasted since the fall, to lead the captives home. Ephesians 4:8-10 declares it boldly. When he ascended on high, he led captivity captive. But before he ascended, he first descended into the lower parts of the earth. Theologians have debated that phrase for centuries, but its meaning is clear. He didn't just touch death, he entered its realm. He didn't merely sleep, he stormed enemy territory, not the grave, the spiritual world of the dead. And he didn't go as a victim. He went as a king, not in chains, but carrying keys. Not to be conquered, but to conquer. In that place where no sunlight shines, where human history's greatest souls had waited for centuries, light broke through. Not a flicker, not a spark. A blaze of glory. Christ had come, and death was no longer in charge. While those trapped across the great divide remained in torment, something shifted. The righteous, who had long waited in silence, could now lift their eyes and behold the promise. the one foretold by prophets, was now walking among the dead. But unlike them, he carried within himself the breath of eternity. Death was never ready for this. Jesus didn't just die. He descended fully aware, fully alive to break death from the inside out. What the world called the end was in fact the beginning of a celestial invasion. Into the darkest corridors of existence, light was walking. And there, in that same invisible realm, beyond the righteous and the condemned, were others. Spirits, not human, not free, bound in chains since the dawn of time. Beings the scriptures only mention in whispers. Peter calls them spirits in prison. They weren't awaiting rescue. They were awaiting judgment. And it was to them that Christ now turned, not with comfort, but with a declaration, a proclamation, not a plea, not a warning. A final word from the cross to the deepest corners of creation. It is finished. For 3 days, the Son of God walked through the unseen realms. His journey was not symbolic. It was literal. He had entered Sheol, the heart of the earth, with divine authority. This was not a detour. It was destiny. Jesus himself had foretold it. Just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Matthew 12:40. This wasn't poetry. It was a spiritual map. The heart of the earth wasn't simply the grave. It was a domain, a place of waiting, of separation, of reckoning. He had work to do, their work no one else could do. The prophets had seen it coming for centuries. Not only would the Messiah destroy sin, he would confront death in its own domain. Psalm 139:8 had already hinted at this truth. If I ascend to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there also. Now, God's omnipresence wasn't just a doctrine. It was a man standing in the depths. The light had entered the abyss. This wasn't a visitation. It was an occupation. Ephesians 4:8-10 spells it out. He descended into the lower parts of the earth, not to be still, but to move, to shake boundaries, to cross dimensions. Jesus walked between worlds, between the timeline of man and the eternal framework of God. And everywhere he stepped, the structure of death cracked. For 3 days, he held the line, not in passive waiting, but in active fulfillment. Those weren't days of delay. They were days of completion. The promises whispered to patriarchs, the hopes carried by kings, the visions of prophets, all were now being fulfilled in the very center of the spiritual cosmos. Until that moment, death had never lost a battle. But now, it had finally met its match. The resurrection doesn't begin at the empty tomb. It begins here, in the quiet, terrible depth where no justice had ever stepped. While Roman guards kept watch above, while disciples hid in fear below, the Redeemer walked through shadows that had never seen the face of mercy. And his mission? To restore what was lost, to reclaim access to God, to speak one final word to powers that once ruled without rival. Every moment was intentional. He didn't wander the underworld. He ruled it. He came as king, as judge, as savior. Psalm 24:7 must have echoed through the unseen gates. Lift up your heads, O you gates, that the King of glory may come in. The righteous rejoiced, the condemned trembled, and the ancient spirits, they knew. These were not the steps of a visitor. These were the steps of the one who had conquered them before they even fell. These beings, those locked in darkness since Noah's day, had waited for this, not for rescue, but for reckoning. Jesus' descent into these depths had been foretold, but never fully understood. Now, it unfolded before them. The silence was about to break. The same voice that had calmed the wind and the waves was now about to thunder through the abyss, not with a request, not with a sermon, but with a decree. a verdict, a proclamation, an announcement that the cross had won, that sin was paid, that the chains were broken, that death no longer had the final word. 1 Peter 3:18-20 gives us one of Scripture's most haunting revelations. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. And he went and preached to the spirits in prison, those who were disobedient long ago, in the days of Noah. This moment is not metaphor. It is warfare. Christ didn't just stand among the dead. He declared victory in their presence. And to those ancient powers who had rebelled, who had fallen, who had waited in chains, he gave no mercy. He gave them truth. The cross had crushed the serpent's head, and now the news had arrived in hell itself. While the righteous in Abraham's bosom looked upon their long-awaited deliverer, those across the abyss trapped in unending torment remained silent. But that silence was about to be broken. Because the one spoken of by ancient prophets, the one promised since Eden, the one whom angels longed to look upon, was now walking among the dead, not as a soul who had succumbed to death, but as the living one carrying within himself the very essence of eternity. This moment fractured everything humanity thought it knew about the afterlife. Jesus had not merely died. He had descended, not as a ghost, not as a shade, but as a conqueror, wrapped in light, pressing into darkness with divine authority. What the disciples above saw as tragic silence, what the Roman guards believed was the end of a rebellion, what the religious leaders called blasphemy finished, was actually the opening act of a heavenly counterstrike. Because something had been waiting beneath the surface, not just the righteous, not just the damned, but something older, something darker. The spirits in prison, these were not souls of men. They were not the lost of Israel or the idolaters of Babylon. They were ancient rebels watchers, sons of God, who had crossed a forbidden line. Back in Genesis 6, the world had descended into chaos. The sons of God took human women as wives and bore to them a hybrid offspring, the Nephilim, giants of violence and corruption. They weren't just physical abominations. They were spiritual violations of heaven's boundary. The book of Jude, verse 6, makes it clear. The angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Peter affirms the same in 2 Peter 2:4. God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them into hell and delivered them into chains of darkness. Imagine that. Not in Sheol, not with mankind, but cast deeper into Tartarus, a spiritual abyss beneath all others, a prison for the most dangerous offenders in all creation. Why so severe? Because their crime wasn't just rebellion, it was invasion. They tried to sabotage the bloodline from which the Messiah would come. And it is to them that Jesus descended, not to plead, not to comfort, but to proclaim. The Greek word is ekerixon, a royal declaration, a battle announcement, not a gospel message but a cosmic decree. He stood before these chained spirits and declared, "You failed. That bloodline you tried to pollute, the Messiah still came. That plan you tried to destroy, it's finished." And the cross, the very thing the powers of hell thought would break him, was the weapon that destroyed them. Imagine the atmosphere in that prison. Thousands, maybe millions of fallen, chained, twisted entities. And then suddenly, a light, a figure, a presence they never thought they'd see again. The same Word who had cast them down at the beginning was now standing among them. Not in defeat, but in complete, sovereign power. And then he spoke, not with kindness, not with sorrow, but with authority so final that the echoes of that declaration would ripple through all eternity. What was meant to stop him only revealed how unstoppable he truly was. And that was just the beginning, because while hell reeled from the announcement, Jesus turned his attention to another place, to another people, the saints of old. Imagine Abraham, eyes wide with holy recognition, the face of the promise now standing before him. Picture Moses, the man who met God in fire, now seeing that same glory in flesh. Think of Ruth, of Esther, of Samuel, of Isaiah, people who had lived by faith, died in hope, and waited in long, holy silence. Jesus didn't go to them just to visit. He went to lead them out, because only the one who conquered death could break open paradise. This was the invisible Exodus. Ephesians 4:8-10 declares, "When he ascended on high, he led captivity captive. But before he ascended, he descended into the lower parts of the earth, and there he opened the gates." He didn't bring them back to earth. He brought them forward into the throne room, into glory, into what they had waited for since the dawn of man. Every second of those 3 days mattered. This was not symbolic. It was strategic, tactical, intentional. The war was not just won on a hill called Golgotha. It was won in a realm beyond sight, where death once sat unchallenged. Because for centuries, death had ruled with iron certainty. From Adam's first breath until the last priest of Israel, humanity lived under this sentence: "You are dust, and to dust you shall return." Genesis 3:19. It was final, unbreakable, until now. Now, the Lamb had entered death's dominion not to suffer, but to strip it of power. Revelation 1:18 captures the moment perfectly. Jesus declares, "I was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I hold the keys of death and Hades." Keys mean ownership, authority, the power to open and shut, and they had been in the wrong hands. Satan had built an empire on the fear of death. He held the world hostage with it. But now, that empire was crumbling. Colossians 2:15 says it clearly. Having disarmed principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. This was not a whisper. It was a cosmic shout. The Prince of Darkness had no accusation left, no weapon, no case to argue, because the one who died without sin had just walked through his front door and walked out with the keys in his hands. Hebrews 2:14-15 declares, "Through death he destroyed the one who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and freed those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death." This was not poetry. This was a military victory in the highest realms. And the keys? They weren't a trophy. They were a transfer of power. Until that moment, no human had ever defeated death by their own authority. Yes, prophets raised the dead. Yes, Jesus raised Lazarus and others. But all of them died again. This time was different. This time, death met its match and lost everything. The author of life had stepped into the final domain of death and emerged holding its keys. He didn't wrestle them from Satan in a clash of swords. He claimed them by right, by justice, by blood. The king had paid the price no one else could, and now, in full authority, he stood in the very heart of the underworld, victorious. Psalm 24 came alive in that moment, like never before. "Lift up your heads, O you gates, be lifted up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in." It wasn't a metaphor. It was a spiritual announcement, echoing through the unseen realm, not into the city gates of Jerusalem, but through the ancient doors of eternity. And heaven asked, "Who is this King of glory?" The answer was no longer hidden. The Lord, strong and mighty. The Lord, mighty in battle. The one who had descended into death was now ascending in glory, and the gates of eternity trembled open before him. There were no armies marching, no trumpets sounding on earth, no priests lighting lamps in the temple. But in the spiritual world, from the highest heavens to the deepest abyss, the impact was cataclysmic. The crucified Christ was now the conquering Christ. And his victory? total, irrevocable, eternal. Picture the moment. The slain lamb, now alive, standing in the very domain that had ruled humanity for millennia, holding in his hands the keys of death and Hades. What once marked the end of every story was now the beginning of something utterly new. For those who believe, death would no longer be a wall. It would become a doorway. And that doorway had just been unlocked. But while he claimed his victory, there were eyes watching. Not the eyes of the condemned, not the fallen angels or spirits in chains, but the eyes of the faithful, the righteous who had waited in hope. They had died without seeing. They had believed without knowing. They had obeyed without understanding. Now, they stood on the other side of the chasm watching the one they had waited for. Abraham's bosom, paradise, the place of rest beneath the earth. It was full, not with mourners, but with heroes of faith. Think of the scene. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, Esther, Isaiah, Daniel, Ruth, standing together, watching. Their lives had echoed with promises, shadows, glimpses, prophecies. Now standing before them was the fulfillment, the author and finisher of their faith. And he had the keys. No longer was he simply the one foretold. He was the one who had come. And he came not just to declare victory, but to set them free. This was the great Exodus, but not from Egypt, from the grave. While darkness still echoed with the sound of Jesus' proclamation to the spirits in prison, another silence began to break, a silence that had hung over the righteous like a holy pause for centuries. These were the ones mentioned in Hebrews 11, those who died in faith, never having received the full promise. But they waited. And now the promise himself had come. The veil had been torn. The blood had been spilled. The way was open. Paradise, serial but temporary, was no longer their destination. It had been their refuge. Now, the gates of heaven itself were ready. They had rested with honor, but the Holy of Holies in heaven could not yet receive them until the perfect Lamb had finished his work. And now, he had. Matthew 27:50-53 gives us a glimpse into this unspoken miracle. The tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many. This is not symbolic. It is literal. A holy invasion. Saints of old flesh, restored, walking in the streets of Jerusalem. They were not ghosts. They were not visions. They were forerunner signs of the deeper Exodus unfolding beneath the surface of history. Ephesians 4:8-10 ties it all together. When he ascended on high, he led captivity captive. This was not poetic language. It was the procession of the redeemed. Those kept in paradisianard, waiting, were now walking behind the King of Glory. They had waited generations for this. Can you imagine it? Enoch, who walked with God. Joseph, who held on to dreams in prison. Deborah, who sang of victory. Jeremiah, who wept for a lost people. Zechariah, who saw visions of a future temple. All of them now walking in triumph behind their Messiah. This wasn't a myth. It was a movement. The first great spiritual migration from death to eternal life. And though the earth saw little, heaven saw everything. A glorious procession by the one with nail-scarred hands and keys swinging at his side. The gates of death behind them. The gates of glory ahead. They were no longer shadows of a covenant to come. They were now heirs of a new, eternal covenant. The cross had opened the way. The veil had been torn. The war had been won. And the first to march through that victory were the saints who had believed before it even came. This was the true Exodus. Not from Pharaoh's hand, but from the grip of the grave. Not from slavery in Egypt, but from captivity and death, not into a promised land, but into the eternal dwelling place of God.